Hello, and welcome to this webinar on deploying InterBase in the cloud. My name is Mary Kelly, and I am an InterBase enthusiast. Part of what I love about InterBase is the flexibility and scale of what you can do with it. Really, no matter the industry or the vertical that you're in, InterBase can be a part of the solution. So for this webinar, we're going to take a look at InterBase in the cloud. So we'll go over what InterBase is, why InterBase should be considered for your cloud instances, and how to go about setting up InterBase in the three most popular cloud platforms available currently: Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, before we jump into a Q&A with some Embarcadero software consultants. What is InterBase? InterBase is a near zero administration, small footprint, and easy to install software that provides a very fast, very powerful, and reliable database engine capable of scaling users for any industry or business size. It's fully customizable to your specific needs, so InterBase is really the database that continues to run. InterBase provides 256-bit encryption, which matches the federal regulations on personally identifiable information, and several other ways to keep your users' data safe by providing database and column level encryption with security and user roles to keep access to data private, which lets you focus on getting your secure applications ready for market. InterBase Servers supports effective disaster recovery planning through live backups, incremental dumps, multi-threaded restores, write-ahead logging, and point-in-time recovery. You can quickly revert databases to any second in time using journal archives, and these archives can be stored off-device to provide the fastest way to recover your server even if a backup hasn't run. You can even take snapshots of the database while users are still connected to and altering data. While InterBase is finely tuned to perform with the Embarcadero developer toolset, Delphi, and C++ Builder, you can still use InterBase with a variety of languages like PHP, Visual C++, and C, and with standard interfaces like ODBC, JDBC, and ADO.NET. Now, InterBase is and has always been designed to be a low-maintenance or self-tuning database, making it great for embedded applications that require little maintenance. With a multi-version architecture and multi-core SMP support, as a developer, you can take advantage of today's multi-core architectures and scale your applications transparently across multiple CPUs. InterBase also possesses a number of tunable config parameters that allow higher end user servers to also operate optimally in their specific environments, allowing for a range of application types to take advantage of built-in monitoring tools that manage threads, transactions, procedures, and even memory usage. So why InterBase in the cloud? The three largest cloud providers are AWS from Amazon, Microsoft Azure, and Google's cloud platform, also known as GCP. Attending this webinar, you probably have some idea of what these cloud solutions providers are, but just to reiterate, AWS, Azure, and GCP are suites of products and tools that provide cloud computing services and management solutions for users or developers, business owners, etc., that enable them to build, test, deploy, and maintain their enterprise or corporate architectures using Microsoft, Amazon, or Google infrastructures in a pay-as-you-go model. At the present time, there are hundreds of services or products that are offered by each of these platforms. Now, AWS was started back in the 2006 timeframe, where it offered managed IT infrastructure to businesses with things like the EC2, and has grown to be the largest majority holder of cloud providers today. You have Google, who came in a few years later in 2008 with an idea or a way to simplify the development and deployment of applications with a customer-centric approach. Now, Amazon released Azure back in the 2010 range, with some initial thoughts relating to it being a place to host Microsoft SQL Server and Server OS in Microsoft-owned data centers. So today we're going to go through and see what it takes to install and deploy InterBase in the cloud. We'll walk through steps and see some of the aspects in real time on how to set InterBase up in your cloud instances. There are a couple of different reasons why you would want to use InterBase in the cloud. Now, I won't go through and name all of them, but a few examples would be things like a mobile application that you might want to use InterBase to go or IB Lite for offline data storage capacity. That's also secure and then can sync deltas to the cloud with InterBase server. Or maybe your organization has been in the process of moving to the cloud and you already have InterBase installed, and you're looking for a way to reduce the cost of managing and maintaining your IT systems. So rather than going out and purchasing a lot of new expensive systems or upgrading those systems and equipment for your organization, you can reduce your costs by using a lot of the resources by the cloud computing service providers. You may be able to reduce your operating costs even just by having fewer time delays. Now, your business can scale up or scale down your operation and storage needs quickly to suit the situation using the cloud. So allowing flexibility as your needs change rather than purchasing and installing a lot of that expensive upgrades hardware yourself, the cloud providers can handle that and provide that to you. So using the cloud can free up a lot of your time so you can get on with running the business and also build out new applications. And the last example that I want to explain is perhaps as a RAD server developer or a RAD server interested party. Maybe you're interested in using the multi-site license and you want to have the same InterBase database for the authentication process as InterBase is included with RAD server. You could put that on a small or micro instance of an EC2 or virtual machine with a static IP address that only the RAD server instances can actually access with some sort of VPC or virtual private cloud. And not only can it be a decent price, but it can allow you to auto scale your architecture by adding in a load balancer and even then being able to spin up containers or virtual instances such as your EC2, your virtual machine, your compute engine, and something for routing. And you can even reduce your downtime by having values set to spin up new instances or spin down new instances as your application demands. So when it comes to the steps for getting InterBase set up in those cloud infrastructures, it's actually pretty similar across all three. The first step you're going to take is to create your account on one of the three instances, whether that be AWS, Microsoft with Azure, and GCP as well. They all provide multiple account levels based on your needs. Your second step is going to be to download the command line interfaces for each of the platforms, whichever of your choosing. If you're working with Google, you will download the Cloud SDK. If you're working with AWS and Azure, you'll download CLI. And there are sets of instructions on how to go about downloading those. You will create those virtual instances. So this could be either EC2, a virtual machine if you're using Azure or Cloud Engine, and all of these will be available based on your platform. You'll connect into the machine, perhaps with an SSH configuration, into your EC2 instance virtual machine. And from there, you'll be able to download and install InterBase. From there, you activate your InterBase file. And from that point in time, you can add the database files and any additional configurations from there. And then, of course, the last step is configuring for maintenance of your InterBase servers. Now for this series of demonstrations, I'm only going to fully install InterBase on AWS, but the process once the EC2 or virtual machines are set up on the other two platforms are going to be the same with the installation. The only big differences here are really going to be your choice of Windows versus Linux. If you choose to use Windows, then you will have access to the IB console and be able to run the Windows installation If you are running Linux, it will be similar to the installation that I'll show you with AWS. Now that we have our EC2 dashboard open, we can go ahead and launch an instance. Now from here, we can make the choice of Windows or Linux. In this case, I'll be using Linux today. And if we take a look at InterBase, the supported Linux instances are Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu. So I'm going to use an Ubuntu 18.04 instance for my EC2, 64-bit. And in this case, I'm going to use the T2 Micro just because my database itself is also very small. We'll continue through the rest of our 7-step configuration. I'll leave my network and subnets at the defaults and just continue through, as I don't need any of those specifics in this instance. If you do find that you're setting up a VPC or a virtual private cloud, you can also go through and configure all of that within your instance beforehand and then set your InterBase database behind that VPC so that your application, EC2, or APIs can then access that. If you do want to include monitoring, you can also add that as well. It does apply additional costs, but in this case, this will allow you to install a CloudWatch agent so that you can monitor logs and also just how the instance is doing in general. We'll go to add storage. Now my database is pretty small, so in this instance I will be all right with the 8 GB size. If you do choose Windows, expect that it'll be at a minimum of 32 gigabytes, just as the operating system is larger. If you do feel that you're going to have a very large database that'll be sitting on your EC2 instance, then you could also go ahead and add an EBS, so an elastic storage file, and that will allow you to expand your additional use for storage size. Go through and add tags. And I just need SSH. So to access our instance, I'm going to use CLI, command line interface, to access. And we'll go through and review and launch. And I will create a new pair. And if you're using a Mac, which in this case, since I am, it might pop up as a certificate, just rename it to .pem and launch our instance. Now our instance is running. Now we'll only care about my IB Server 1 instance that's running. And the important details that we're really going to look at are going to be the IPv4 address as well. You can also look at any of the other specifications here. Now in this case, since we're just creating the shell of our EC2 instance, we're not going to need to use any other services at this point, unless you do wish to use something like CloudWatch or Datadog or an additional monitoring or streaming such as Kinesis. Now at this point, we want to take a look at our PEM files and find that. So currently I have the IB Server 1 PEM file, and I just need to chmod 400 IB Server 1.pem. And now that PEM file only has read access, then I can go through and SSH using that IB server PEM file, then use Ubuntu at the public IP address. So you could just copy that, and we'll go ahead and click yes. And it'll permanently add that to its list of known hosts. And now we're in our EC2 instance. So I'll just run a sudo apt update. Now at this point, we have our EC2 instance that's all set up and going to be readily available for us to install InterBase onto. Now our first step is going to be to take the InterBase instance that we're going to be installing. Since we will be running on Linux, I'm going to copy from my Mac desktop into my Linux distro my InterBase 2020 Linux zip file. So we'll do an scp-i using that IB server 1.pem file. Use InterBase _2020 Linux.zip. Now you can also install this if you happen to have the alt-d URL address that's provided. And then we'll just go ahead and log into that Ubuntu at, copy this address again, and then set that in the home Ubuntu directory. And it's just going to move that file across. I'll go ahead and speed through that. Now that that's been copied to my Ubuntu instance, we can just go ahead and list out all of the files. Now we can see that I've got my InterBase 2020 Linux moved over to this machine. Now we can just do a sudo apt install of unzip because I don't have that installed yet. And now I can unzip my IB InterBase underscore 2020 underscore linux.zip file. Now, in certain instances, you will have to elevate the permissions. I find that on my cloud instances, I always have to upgrade those. So I'll choose to install the 64-bit version of InterBase. And I'll clear out the screen so that it'll be easier. We'll do sudo install underscore linux underscore x86 underscore 64 .sh -i. Then, of course, console, because we do not have a GUI. And we'll let it run through that installation. Press enter. We will run the 64-bit version. I want both client and server. Now, as with all instances of InterBase, you can choose if you want to have multiple instances that will be running on the same machine. In this situation, I only want this instance of InterBase to be running. If you do choose to have multiple instances running, you will need to uniquely identify or create a specific name for each instance. So I'll say no, and I'll let it install to the OPT InterBase folder. All right, so now it's installed, and I'll just do a cd -opt -interbase -bin folder, and if we just go ahead and list everything in there, we're going to take a look at this license manager launcher. Now, before you start your instance of InterBase on a Linux machine, register the license that you will have received or that you have, even if it's a slip file, so that the server will start. We'll do sudo license manager launcher -i console again, and we'll do a direct registration. It'll connect to our Embarcadero server. Then from there, you can enter your serial number. It'll ask you if you have a Embarcadero developer network account. You can say yes or no, and it'll ask you to create one if you don't. And if you do, it'll just ask for your login credentials, and as well as the password. Click enter, and it should register that license. And click enter to continue, and 5 to quit. And we'll run sudo ibmgr, and we'll just start that. And now our server's been started. We can exit out of the IB manager now that our server's been started, and now we can connect to our InterBase database. Now I can just go through and set my ICS underscore user to sysdba and the ICS password to as master key. And now we can take a look at the examples that we have within InterBase, the examples folder, examples, and we'll also go through and now the database, I'm just going to list them all out so you can see which database that I'm going to connect to, is one of our sample databases, the employee.gdb database. So if we exit out of this and go back to InterBase, clear this. Now we will just connect to iSQL with the examples employee.gdb database. And we can now see all of the tables within that database. So if we select everything from, let's say employee, then we can see our list of employees. here, and we now have access to this database. So the database server has started and the database is up and running. And now we could go through and connect to this database from any of our applications available. So if you were connecting to your InterBase instance from Rad Studio, you could very easily just go copy the IP address and use that to connect to your InterBase database from your Rad Studio application. Now, when you're looking at Azure and also Google Cloud, with Azure, you're going to create a virtual machine, which is basically the same thing as an EC2 instance, just a different title. So you'll go and create your virtual machine. And with Azure as well, it is still a 7-step process that you'll follow. You'll give your instance a name. I'll say IB server. You also have a full list of servers that you could choose. So if we just continue to go through this process, the username we'll create will be Azure user, and you can then choose to use a specific pair name as well. You can generate or choose an existing one that you already have stored. And in this case, we're going to just use SSH again. Now, in terms of your inbound port rules, as I said, I'm going to use SSH again for this one. Now, if you know that your instance will need to be protected, you could also set it up behind a VPC, which would then allow you to have a bastion host so that the database server itself can only be accessed by your application servers rather than by any individual user. So you'd have to connect to that application server and then have the credentials to connect to your database server, all within your virtual private cloud network. Disks, we'll go ahead and use the premium hard disk, but depending on whatever you need for your instances, I either recommend standard or premium. And same thing with the encryption type. Now, while you can encrypt your InterBase server itself, if you would like to encrypt your ability to connect to your instance, which in many cases you do, or if you need to be more careful about the users specifically that you'll be running within your network, then of course encryption is always a great added bonus there. Same thing with networking. We'll keep this as our default subnet, and our public IP will create a new one, and we'll leave our public IP, we'll keep basic since I'm not going to be changing anything. You can also set up a backup. Now this will back up the entire virtual machine. It won't just back up the InterBase database, it will back up everything. I'll go through and just create this instance. You can download the private key. I already have an InterBase server key there, so it creates this VM. It'll take a few moments, and we can see here that the deployment has succeeded. So we can go to the resource, and we now have an InterBase server instance of a virtual machine up and running. So now we can SSH into this application using the public IP address right here, connect to that user, and be able to, again, either download or install or copy the InterBase Linux distro into our virtual machine. And similarly with creating a compute engine or CE virtual machine in Google Cloud Platform, that everything will be held under. Now, each individual project has one single user that's provided to it. We'll create this instance. We'll call it IB server 1, of course, all lowercase. And you can choose the region that you want. In this case, I'll choose Iowa since I am Central Time Zone. And if you happen to have a zone specifically that you want to use, you can also do that. Setting up your machine configuration. There are multiple different platforms. So in this case, we'll use a CPU based on the availability. And of course, you can choose the type of server that you're looking for. Now with InterBase, you'll notice that for the shared cores at least, and for even the standard cores, InterBase specifically does not need a lot of memory and a lot of storage size. If we take a look at the installation requirements again real quick, the space needed for an installation for the server and the client is only 117 megabytes, and the installation files themselves are about 250 megabytes. So less than 300 megabytes total for that. And when you go through and install InterBase, the amount of RAM that you'll use, is going to be more preferable to your instance and what you specifically need. But if you don't need that much, you could even get by with the E2 medium or even a small, or you can also go larger as well. Now, one nice feature is that you can also deploy a container image. So if you happen to create an image, such as a Docker image of InterBase, you can go through and deploy that Docker image so that as you scale out the number of InterBase instances that you need, you then have InterBase available and running. You can then, alongside that, prepare a script file that will register the license so that you can always have a license readily available for InterBase and ensure that your startup process will run smoothly. Now, we'll allow both sets of traffic to exist. So it just takes a few moments to set this up with EC2 and virtual machine instances. It can take anywhere, depending on the size, from a half a minute all the way up to, I've seen 5 minutes to create an instance for some of the larger instances. And that'll be mostly dependent upon your CPU configurations and your disk size as well. Now, at this point, we've created our IB server, and from there, we can go and install InterBase. Now, one last specification is right here under permissions. You can create specific users for accessing each of your instances. Now, if you do just choose to SSH, you can also open it in a web browser, or you can use any SSH client that you choose, or even use gCloud, which is the Google Cloud SDK that you can download and use. And then last, of course, since I have made mention of it, maintaining InterBase in the cloud. When it comes to maintaining databases using backups or journaling and journal archiving, there are always questions as to how would you take advantage of the managed services that are provided by these cloud providers to help you either reduce costs or increase availability of your database instance. So in the case of Amazon, you can use something like CloudWatch or even Datadog if you have multiple accounts, where CloudWatch, you can install an agent and have that agent monitor logs. So the InterBase.log file as well as EC2 instance log file can also be monitored for any problems, so that as an error occurs in your InterBase database, you can have a Kinesis stream that moves the data from that InterBase log file and copies it into a log, where then you could get notifications about problems that might be occurring. So this can be helpful in the case of emergencies. So maybe you have a journaling and journal archiving system set up. You could take those journals, you could then move the journal archives into a storage solution. Perhaps you are using AWS or even Azure and GCP. You can use a S3 instance. You could use Google Object Storage or Azure Blob, one of those, and you could keep within that storage solution all of your journal archive files, so that as something happens, if the server registers as going down, at any point in time, you could set up a Lambda instance or something to automate the restoration process. So if in the event that the server goes down, you can then spin up a new virtual machine or EC2 instance that has that base image of InterBase installed and licensed, and you can then use that in the event of a master failure, where you can either restore or recover the latest data file from a backup bucket using the restore script built into a Lambda. Now, Lambda is AWS's serverless option for short jobs, specifically as in less than 10 or 15 minutes. But of course, you can do the same with Azure and Google Cloud. They use something called Cloud Functions or Azure Functions or automation. And from there, you can ensure that in the event of failure or maintaining your database, you can have those database backup files. You can have your journals and your journal archives all stored within your cloud provider's instance, and actually automate the process to the point where you can get email or text notifications in the event of failure or just any problems that arise from within your instance of AWS, Azure, or Google. Thank you again for joining this webinar today on deploying InterBase in the cloud. I hope that it has helped you see how to install InterBase and how to activate and build your InterBase environment in either Azure, AWS, or Google. let's move on to our Q&A.
There's a quick question here, along with a few thank yous for the webinar so far as well. Are there any extra steps that are needed to support VM snapshots that shortly freeze the storage?
As in, okay, so to create snapshots in like Azure or with Google, there's not really any extra steps that necessarily need to be taken. Just know that when you do make those, when you do go ahead and make those snapshots, any of your extra kind of managed services that you use will actually fall off. So when then you start up a new instance, it will, you might have to reconfigure a few things. But for the most part, there really aren't any extra steps that are needed to be able to freeze the storage for a VM snapshot.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think, well, yeah, one of the key things, just remember whenever you're taking or working with machines and you're trying to back up data, when you've got live handles to the actual database, if you try to back up the actual data file, then obviously you could have potential corruption on the file if it's being written to at the same point that you're moving it. So obviously make sure if you're backing up that you're using kind of incremental data dumps or using kind of the journal archives, or you're just using the standard backups to produce the file that you actually physically back up. If you want to trap any updates and changes and kind of keep those live, then if you need to kind of keep that kind of balanced over multiple machines or whatever, then things like change views are an awesome way to be able to manage that. You can do that quite simply with having a subscription against any data that you want to mirror out onto another database instance, and then use the InterBase alerts on the tables to pick up that there's a change, and then just use the change view to pick up the query delta for the destination you want to move it to, and then just pull it across. So that can be a very effective way to scale out exceptionally quickly as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any kind of any advice in terms of using the different cloud services? Do you find there's any kind of better than others, or not from to pick up and use from your experience?
So, I mean, each cloud instance or each of the major providers obviously have kind of their pieces that they've worked out and scaled a little bit more. So there's areas that they do better than others. I did tend to find, because I actually went through the process of I've installed InterBase on each of these platforms. And Azure was very easy for Windows. I ended up setting up a Windows server and was able to deploy an InterBase application there. So that part was very nice on Windows, but I did find that using Azure with Linux wasn't as easy of a process for me to like when I went to SSH into the machine, I did have to configure a few little things here and there slightly differently compared to AWS and with Google as well. So with AWS, I did find that it was a little bit easier kind of configuring Ubuntu already and getting that all set up.
Cool. Okay. A couple of thank yous for the comments around those bits, answering those. I think having a quick look at the kind of questions that have popped through here. I think the key ones have kind of been picked up by later parts as we've gone through the webinar. So I don't think there's anything major here to kind of add in addition to what's been said through. Any kind of additional kind of comments that you want to put in at this point, Mary?
Just to say good luck to anyone who is working on cloud instances and wants to use InterBase. It really is a fantastic product to use in the cloud. It may not be designed for the cloud from the beginning, but you can take advantage of so many different services out there and integrate and seamlessly integrate InterBase in with the rest of your processes. So just to say good luck with that.
Cool. Yeah, and obviously, if you are looking for support around that, then feel free to reach out to your Embarcadero sales team, who will be happy to kind of help connect you to internal pre-sales consultants who can help you kind of get started, or additionally kind of point you towards people like our MVPs. Mary is one of those as well. And obviously they're available and ready to help and support you, externally, and obviously you can sort out your agreements with them for that. So there's another question here. I'm just trying to read it. You showed an option for loading a container with GCP. Is the same possible, just as easy with Azure or AWS?
It is. So specifically, if you're setting up a container, maybe like a Docker instance, right? You can install InterBase on there and you can actually deploy those containers out. And the process with both Azure and AWS are also very easy to do. It is basically just like again, kind of the option. I just didn't happen to show it in Azure or in AWS, but it is just as easy to go ahead and accomplish that.
Mm-hmm. And also, InterBase is part of the kind of the RAD server setup and configuration. So there's some Docker instances around for getting that set up and run. But also, the stuff that Mary's covered here earlier in terms of getting InterBase installed and configured with your license. That's all you need to do in terms of the kind of the RAD server element, having the backend license server there. That's a great option if you're setting up your virtual private network with your InterBase server for managing RAD server, and then having all your additional kind of load balancing for the requests coming in balanced off through kind of Docker containers that are running kind of the RAD server front end part of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Back end.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and actually, yeah, and from there, and I think I even mentioned this in the video as well, but do make sure that you set it up as like a bastion host, so that you make sure that nothing is touching the InterBase instance that will be for RAD server or the backend database in general, making sure that only traffic can hit the application. So your RAD server instances, make sure that only your RAD server instances can touch the database. Otherwise, and that's just from a security perspective. So that's probably going to be the biggest key advice I can give anyone wanting to set up an instance of InterBase in the cloud.
But I think it's amazing. You kind of look at what's available with the cloud now in terms of hardware configuration and setup, and being able to just set things up and use it for a couple of days for a project and then dispose of it afterwards, or just in general, just being able to get stuff up and running as you need it. Compared to what you've had to have done in the past in terms of getting it, hosting it, managing the connections, all the other kind of side of things. I know the cloud is not particularly new now, but certainly in terms of the ability to spin up and get things moving, it's amazing what we can achieve with that kind of setup. And especially if you look at things like change views, more and more now we're seeing people spin a copy of InterBase up alongside their existing infrastructure, things like SQL Server or Oracle or other backend databases that are running their critical systems. And rather than replacing those, they're using InterBase alongside it to mirror data into InterBase to then be able to use the power of change views to fetch the delta changes over time for a large number of distributed clients. Being able to set up and run InterBase easily in the cloud, as you've been able to see today, to be able to add that power of change views alongside existing infrastructure that you might already have in the cloud or moving to the cloud. It's a phenomenal option to help in terms of the scaling and the distribution and management of delta and changes out to remote destinations. Okay, Mary, I think we've hit the end of the kind of questions that have been popping through here. So if you have any questions following from the webinar, please feel free to just reach out to your local sales team. You can email me directly, stephen.ball@embarcadero.com, or just connect up to any one of the local sales reps. We'll be able to put you in touch with local representatives around the world to be able to support you as you're moving forward with your projects. We love hearing what you're getting up to. There's some amazing kind of things that we hear just around the product, and it's great just to be able to feed those back into the product team. They love hearing about what our customers are doing, because it helps them in terms of the prioritization of future development as well. So if you've got lovely InterBase stories, feel free to share them through. We look forward to hearing from you and helping you on your next project as you get moving forward. Thank you again, Mary, for joining us in your kind of new role as an MVP today, and being part of the webinar. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, everyone, happy coding. Thanks for joining us today, and look forward to chatting with you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.